Welcome, my dear listener. Tonight, I shall tell you of an age when the world was young and the stars were closer to men as hearts. I have walked through countless centuries, witnessed the rise and fall of empires that shook the earth, and observed the quiet persistence of civilizations that refused to fade into darkness. Yet, among all the stories etched into the fabric of time, few burn as brightly in my memory as that of Persia, a land where mountains meet deserts, where ancient wisdom flows like water through stone, and where an empire was born that would shape the very soul of humanity. Close your eyes for a moment, dear listener, and breathe deeply. Can you smell it? The faint scent of saffron and rosewater carried on a desert wind. Can you hear it? The distant echo of hoofbeats across high plateaus, the whisper of silk curtains in palace halls, the crackle of sacred fires that have burned without ceasing for 1,000 years. This is Persia, not merely a place upon a map, but a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit. A civilization that has been conquered by Greeks, invaded by Arabs, devastated by Mongols, yet each time, like a phoenix rising from ash, it has returned more luminous than before. Tonight, I shall unfold for you a tapestry woven across 7,000 years. We shall walk together through mountain villages where the first farmers coaxed grain from reluctant soil. We shall stand in the shadow of Persepolis, that magnificent city of columns and carved stone. We shall witness the terrible beauty of conquest and the quiet triumph of cultural survival. But this is not merely a tale of kings and battles, though there will be plenty of both. This is a story of ordinary souls, farmers and craftsmen, priests and poets, mothers and merchants, whose lives created the threads from which empires are woven. For what is history, after all, but the accumulated dreams and struggles of countless forgotten hearts? I remember the cold wind that swept across the Zagros Mountains on a morning 7,000 years past. I remember the first time I saw the great ceremonial capital rise from the plain, its columns reaching toward heaven like prayers made stone. I remember the flames, oh, the flames, when Alexander's soldiers put torch to that magnificent city. And I remember the phoenix that rose from those very ashes. So settle yourself comfortably, dear listener. Pour yourself wine or tea. Draw your blankets close, for we have a long journey ahead of us, and the path winds through ages of wonder and terror, triumph and tragedy, destruction and rebirth. The story begins not with thunder, but with a whisper, the whisper of wind through barley fields, the whisper of goats stirring in their pens before dawn, the whisper of a dream that would become an empire. Come, let us begin. The morning I recall most clearly from those ancient days broke cold and gray over the Zagros Mountains. 7,200 years have passed since then, yet I can still feel the chill of that pre-dawn air, still smell the wood smoke hanging heavy in the valley. In a small cluster of mud brick dwellings pressed against the mountainside, a family stirred to wakefulness. This was not yet Persia. That name lay millennia in the future. This was simply the world as it had always been, harsh, beautiful, and demanding. The mother of the household rose first, as she always did. Her joints ached from sleeping on a reed mat over packed earth, and she moved slowly in the darkness, feeling her way toward the cooking area where embers from the previous night's fire still glowed faintly. Outside, the goats were already bleating, impatient for their morning feeding. Time to wake, she called softly to her children, her voice carrying the weight of countless mornings, just like this one. the barley will not harvest itself. This is how empires begin, dear listener. Not with grand proclamations or divine mandates, but with ordinary people rising before the sun, doing what must be done to survive another day. These early settlers, the very first farmers in what would one day become the heart of Persian civilization, had made a choice their grandparents could scarcely have imagined. Instead of following herds across endless grasslands, instead of moving with the seasons like water flowing downhill, they had stopped, they had built, they had planted seeds in earth and waited, trusting that those seeds would return, multiplied. It was a revolutionary act, though they did not think of it in such terms. They thought only of their children, of surviving the winter, of building something that might last beyond their own brief lives. I watched them that morning, as I have watched so many mornings, and I saw in their simple actions the seeds of something far greater than they could comprehend. The daughter grinding grain between two stones, she was laying the foundation for cities. The son tending goats on the mountainside, he was preparing the way for armies that would shake the world. The grandmother sitting by the fire, telling stories of times before, she was preserving the memory that would become culture, identity, civilization itself. The settlement where they lived clung to the slopes of the Zagros, like a bird's nest tucked into a cliff face. Below them stretched the plains that would one day be called Mesopotamia. Above them rose the mountains, their peaks still crowned with snow, even as spring warmed the valleys. This landscape, this eternal conversation between mountain and plain, between the vertical world of stone and the horizontal world of river and soil, would shape everything that followed. The mountain peoples would develop one character, tough, self-reliant, accustomed to scarcity. The plains peoples would develop another, organized, hierarchical, dependent on complex systems of irrigation and cooperation. And the tension between these two worlds, dear listener, would echo through Persian history for thousands of years, right down to conflicts within living memory. The plains people think themselves superior to us, the father said one evening, as he carved a wooden figure by firelight. His hands moved with practiced skill, shaping the soft wood into the form of a bull. They speak of their great cities, their canals, their temples, but when raiders come from the desert, where do they flee? They have nowhere to hide. We have the mountains. His wife looked up from her weaving, a slight smile on her weathered face. And when winter comes early and our crops fail, where do we go to trade for grain? The mountains cannot feed us alone, husband. We need them as they need us, even if neither wishes to admit it. This wisdom, the recognition that different peoples and different ways of life are not enemies but necessary complements, would become one of the great strengths of Persian civilization. But that understanding lay far in the future. For now, there was only survival, day by difficult day. The clay pot the daughter carried down to the stream for water was itself a marvel, though she thought nothing of it. Her grandmother had made it, shaping wet clay with patient hands, firing it in a pit lined with burning wood. For people who had previously used animal skins or woven baskets sealed with pitch, these ceramic vessels were nothing short of miraculous. They held water, they did not rot, they could be passed from mother to daughter across generations. As the girl knelt by the stream, filling her pot, an old woman from a neighboring family approached. Her face was a landscape of wrinkles, her hair the color of winter clouds. "Did you hear?" the old woman asked, her voice pitched low as if sharing a secret. Traders came to the valley settlement 3 days past. They brought stones from far to the east, beautiful blue stones that catch the light like pieces of sky fallen to earth. The girl's eyes widened. What do they want in exchange for such treasures? Grain, wool, worked copper. The traders say these blue stones come from mountains beyond mountains, from places where the rivers are wider than 10 men lying head to foot. The stones she spoke of were lapis lazuli, mined in the distant reaches of what is now Afghanistan, and those traders, walking their dangerous routes from mountain to mountain, from valley to valley, were weaving the first threads of what would eventually become the Silk Road, that great artery of commerce that would connect Europe and Asia, with Persia at its beating heart. But such grand visions were impossible to these simple people. They knew only their valley, the next valley over, perhaps rumors of settlements, a week's journey distant. The world beyond was vast mystery, populated in their minds by spirits and monsters, as much as by other human beings. Yet even in this small world, change was gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. The seasons turned, children were born, elders died and were mourned. The settlement grew, one mud brick house at a time, and slowly, imperceptibly, something new was emerging. Not just a village, but a way of life. Not just a way of life, but a culture. Not just a culture, but the first whispers of what would become a civilization. I have lived long enough, dear listener, to know that nothing begins suddenly. Every empire, every culture, every great work of human hands starts as a seed so small it might go unnoticed. A family choosing to stop wandering, a potter perfecting her craft, a trader willing to walk a dangerous path because he believes that what lies beyond the mountains is worth discovering. These people in their mountain settlement, scratching at the soil, tending their goats, trading their simple goods, they were planting seeds that would not bear fruit for millennia, but bear fruit they would. From these humble beginnings would rise something magnificent, a civilization that would survive conquest after conquest, that would absorb invaders rather than being absorbed, that would give the world new ways of thinking about justice, governance, and the relationship between power and mercy. As night fell over the Zagros Mountains, the family gathered around their fire. The father told stories his father had told him, stories that reached back into the time before memory, when gods walked the earth and taught men the secrets of fire and seed. The mother sang old songs in a language that was already ancient. The children listened, absorbing not just the words, but something deeper, a sense of belonging, of continuity, of being part of something larger than any individual life. And in the darkness beyond the firelight, the mountains stood eternal and patient, keeping their secrets, waiting for the day when their children would descend to the plains and claim their destiny. The stars wheeled overhead in their slow dance. The sacred fire burned low, and somewhere in the fabric of time, the future stirred, preparing to be born. This was the first light of dawn, dear listener, the first chapter in a story that would span millennia, the first breath of what would become Persia. But morning was still coming. The full brightness of day lay far ahead, and oh, what a glorious, terrible day it would be. 2,000 years passed like water flowing through stone, slowly reshaping everything it touched. The small mountain settlement I showed you has multiplied into dozens, then hundreds of villages across the Iranian plateau. And in the lowlands, something altogether different has emerged. I remember standing on a hill overlooking Susa for the first time. It was no longer a settlement. It had become a city, a concentration of human ambition and ingenuity that would have been incomprehensible to those first. Farmers in their mountain huts, The year was approximately 4,395 years before the birth of the Christian Messiah, though of course such measurements meant nothing to the people living through those days. They marked time by kings and harvests, by floods and droughts, by the rising and setting of particular stars. Susa sprawled across the plain like a living organism, its mud brick buildings pressed together so tightly that from above they appeared as a single mass of ochre and brown. Smoke rose from hundreds of cooking fires. The sound of humanity, voices calling, children laughing, merchants haggling, craftsmen hammering, created a constant hum that never entirely faded, even in the depths of night. "This changes everything," whispered a merchant who had arrived with me, a man from one of the mountain tribes who had never before seen such a concentration of humanity. His eyes were wide with wonder and perhaps a touch of fear. "So many people in one place. How do they feed them all? How do they keep order?" Indeed, that was the question, was it not? And the answer to that question would shape the future of human civilization. Susa sat at the crossroads of two worlds, the mountains to the east and the Mesopotamian plains to the west. This strategic location made it wealthy, for all trade between these regions had to pass through or near the city. But more importantly, it made Susa a crucible where different peoples, different ideas, different ways of organizing human society could meet and mingle. The Elamites, for that, is what we began to call the people of this region, were developing something unprecedented, a state, not just a collection of villages acknowledging the same chief, but an organized system of governance, taxation, record-keeping, and law. I walked through the city's streets as a scholar might walk through a library, reading in every detail the story of human progress and human folly written in equal measure. Here, a temple where priests offered sacrifices to Usinak, the patron god of Susa. The walls were decorated with images of bulls and serpents, rendered in simple but powerful lines. Unlike the temples of Mesopotamia, with their focus on human and human-animal hybrid forms, Elamite art celebrated the natural world, the animals that sustained life, the forces of nature that could bless or destroy. All gods deserve respect, a priest explained to me when I paused to observe a ritual. He was an old man, his beard dyed black in the fashion of the time. His robes marked with symbols I could not fully interpret. The gods of our neighbors may not be our gods, but they are gods nonetheless. To deny them is to invite their wrath upon our people. This tolerance, this openness to other ways of seeing the divine, would become one of the hallmarks of Persian civilization. But it would be tested again and again by those who believed truth could only wear one face. In another quarter of the city, I found workshops where craftsmen created pottery of remarkable sophistication, painted with geometric patterns and stylized animals. A young woman, no more than 16 summers in age, painted a vessel with steady hands, while her grandmother supervised. "See how the bull's horns curve," the elder said, pointing with a gnarled finger. "That is how you know it is powerful. The curve must be just so. Too little, and it looks weak. Too much, and it looks unnatural. Balance in all things. That is the secret. Balance in all things." I tucked that phrase away in my memory, for I would hear it echoed in different forms throughout Persian history. The pursuit of balance between power and mercy, between tradition and innovation, between the claims of the individual and the needs of the community. This would become a defining characteristic of Persian thought. But balance is difficult to maintain, especially when the world around you is in constant flux. To the west, in the land between the rivers, great powers were rising and falling with terrifying speed. The Sumerians, who had created the world's first writing system and built cities of unprecedented grandeur. The Akkadians, who had forged the first multi-ethnic empire. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, each in turn claiming dominion over the known world. And Elam, sitting at the crossroads, could not remain isolated from these conflicts. I remember the first time war came to Susa. The year was approximately 2,700 years before the Christian era. I had returned to the city after some years away, and I could feel the tension in the air like pressure before a storm. The Sumerian king claims that we have stolen temple property from his city, an Elamite official explained to a gathered crowd in the marketplace. His voice was steady, but I could see fear in his eyes. He has sent an army to reclaim what he says is his by right. An old warrior, his body marked with scars from previous conflicts, spat on the ground. Let them come. We have walls. We have warriors. Susa has stood for 1,000 years and will stand for 1,000 more. But the old warrior's confidence was misplaced. The Sumerian army that appeared on the horizon was unlike anything Elam had faced before. Organized, disciplined, equipped with bronze weapons and tactics, refined through countless campaigns. The battle, when it came, was brief and brutal. I watched from the city walls as the Elamite forces were systematically broken apart. Their courage, insufficient armor against superior numbers and strategy. By sunset, Sumerian soldiers were entering the city, and the age of Elam's innocence was over. They came from the west like a flood. An old warrior told younger men years later, his voice still haunted by the memory. I had found him sitting in a tavern, wine cup in hand, surrounded by a new generation that had never known true war. He pulled aside his robe to show scars that crisscrossed his torso like rivers on a map, too many to count. We fought by all the gods. We fought, but ... he could not finish. Some memories are too heavy for words. Susa fell under Sumerian control during the reign of the legendary Sargon of Akkad. But here is what the conquerors did not understand. What no conqueror of Persia would ever fully grasp. You can take a city, but you cannot so easily take the soul of a people. The Elamites bent under occupation, but did not break. They learned from their conquerors, absorbed new techniques and ideas, and waited. And when Sumerian power waned, as all power must eventually wane, Elam rose again. By 1,100 years before the Christian era, under King Shetruk-Nakut, Elamite forces swept across Mesopotamia, briefly establishing Elam as the dominant power in the region. The king celebrated his victories by bringing back to Susa the most sacred treasures of the cities he had conquered, not to destroy them, but to display them as evidence of Elam's might. My father fought in those campaigns, a merchant told me in the market of a restored Susa, pride evident in his voice. He said the Babylonians wept when we took the statue of Marduk from their great temple. But King Shetruk-Nakut said, better the god should come to Susa than that Susa should be destroyed in his name. Was he not wise? Perhaps, or perhaps he was simply pragmatic. But wisdom and pragmatism are not always so different, are they? Yet Elam's dominance was as brief as a desert flower after rain. Internal conflicts weakened the state, and Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon eventually conquered Elam in 1,120 years before the Christian era, bringing this particular chapter of the story to a close. But endings are never quite as final as they appear. Even under foreign rule, Elam prospered through trade. Archaeological evidence shows that Elamite merchants were trading with the Indus Valley civilization in what is now Pakistan, with settlements in eastern Iran and Afghanistan, with Egypt, with the farthest reaches of the known world. I traveled with one such caravan as it wound its way through mountain passes toward the east. The journey took months, and every day brought new dangers, bandits, weather, animals, and the simple challenge of finding enough food and water in a hostile landscape. "Why do you risk such a journey?" I asked the caravan leader one evening as we sat around a campfire, the stars impossibly bright in the mountain darkness. He smiled, revealing teeth stained dark from chewing beetle leaf. "See this?" He held up a small piece of lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone catching the firelight. "This came from mines beyond the eastern mountains. In Susa, it is worth its weight in copper. In Babylon, its weight in silver. In Egypt, its weight in gold. My grandfather made this journey, and his father before him. The road is dangerous, but the reward... He laughed, a sound that echoed off the mountainsides. "The reward makes a man's children wealthy, and his name remembered." These trade networks were more than commercial ventures. They were the arteries through which ideas flowed. New technologies, new religious concepts, new ways of organizing society. A farmer in Susa might use a tool designed in Mesopotamia, worship using practices borrowed from the Indus Valley, and wear cloth dyed with techniques developed in Anatolia. The world, I saw, was becoming connected, and at the center of these connections, always, was the Iranian plateau. Persia was not yet an empire, not yet even a unified people, but it was becoming something perhaps more important, a crossroads, a meeting place, a crucible where different cultures could blend into something new. And into this crucible, something new was indeed coming. From the northern steppes, from the vast grasslands that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of China, nomadic peoples were on the move. They called themselves Arya, the noble ones. History would remember them as the Indo-Iranian peoples, and they would change everything. I first encountered them on the northern borders of Elam, where the settled lands gave way to grasslands. They came not as an army, but in small groups, families, clans, driving herds of horses and sheep, their possessions, packed on ox-drawn carts, their children riding alongside on horses they seemed to have been born to ride. They came with their horses and their strange tongue. An elderly Elamite woman recounted to her grandchildren years later, her voice carrying the weight of witness. I sat nearby, listening, as I have listened to so many stories across the ages. They were fierce warriors, but they knew nothing of building or planting. We taught them these things, and they taught us their ways of riding and fighting. This is how cultures evolve, dear listener, not through sudden transformation, but through slow, often uncomfortable mixing. The Elamites and the new Iranian arrivals began to intermarry, to exchange knowledge, to influence each other in countless subtle ways. The process would take more than a millennium to complete. For centuries, Elamite culture and language persisted even as Iranian peoples became increasingly dominant. It was a gradual transition, like water slowly staining a cloth, until the original color is changed but not entirely lost. I watched this transformation with fascination. The newcomers brought their sky gods and their horse culture, their emphasis on warrior valor and their distinctive language. The Elamites contributed their administrative sophistication, their knowledge of irrigation and city governance, their artistic traditions and religious practices. From this union, something unprecedented would eventually emerge, but that emergence lay in the future. For now, there was only the slow work of two peoples learning to live together, to understand each other, to become something neither had been before. As I walked through Susa in those transitional years, I could see evidence of the mixing everywhere. A temple to an Elamite goddess, where prayers were now offered in the Iranian tongue. A marketplace where Iranian nomads traded horses for Elamite pottery. Children playing in the streets who spoke both languages with equal fluency, who honored both their mother's gods and their father's gods, who belonged to both worlds and therefore to neither. What are we becoming? A young Iranian nobleman asked me once, late at night, over wine. He had been born in the city, educated in Elamite schools, yet he still remembered the stories his grandfather told of life on the steppes. Are we still Arya? Have we become Elamites? Or are we something else entirely, something new under the sun? I smiled at his question, for I had heard similar questions in other times, in other places. Perhaps, I suggested, you are becoming what you were always meant to be. Not Arya, not Elamites, but Iranians, and one day Persians. He laughed, not believing me. How could he? The very concept of a unified Persian identity, let alone a Persian empire, was unimaginable to him. But I had seen enough of history to know that the unimaginable has a way of becoming inevitable, given enough time. The sun set over Susa that evening, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the temple, priests tended fires that had burned without ceasing for generations. In the markets, merchants from a dozen lands spoke in a babel of tongues. In the homes, families gathered for evening meals, telling stories that wove together the past and present into something that might, one day, become a shared future. The shadows were growing longer. Night was coming. But with night would come stars, and with stars would come navigation, direction, the possibility of finding one's way, even in darkness. Persia was not yet born, but it was gestating, taking shape in the womb of time, preparing for the moment of its birth. And when that birth finally came, it would shake the world. Chapter 3: The Dawn of Kings, when nomads became masters of the world. The morning wind carried the scent of horses and leather across the high plateau, 700 years before the Christian era, and the world was again in motion. I stood among the Iranian nomads, those descendants of the Arya who had filtered into the region over the previous millennium, and I watched as they prepared for something that would echo through eternity. The Medes. Do you know that name, dear listener? History has somewhat obscured their glory, overshadowed by what would come after. But the Medes were the first to glimpse what would become the Persian dream, the unification of the Iranian peoples into a single mighty state. The camp stirred with pre-dawn activity. Women stoked cooking fires, while men checked weapons and tended to horses. Children darted between the felt tents, playing games that mimicked the warrior training they would begin in earnest within a few years. Another day, said a young warrior named Harpagus, stretching as he emerged from his tent. His voice carried the mix of anticipation and resignation that marks those who have known only nomadic life. Another camp, another sunrise. My father saw 50 summers of this before disease took him. Will I see 50 more of the same? Or will something finally change? Oh, dear friend, I thought, watching him, you have no idea how profoundly things are about to change. For to the west, The Assyrian Empire had become an insatiable monster. Their armies swept across the known world, leaving devastation in their wake. Their kings boasted openly of flaying conquered peoples alive, of building pyramids from severed heads, of turning entire cities into ash and memory. Bad news from the western settlements. An older warrior announced, returning from a trading journey to the lowlands. He gathered the men around the central fire, his face grim in the flickering light. The Assyrians have taken 3 more towns in the foothills. They skin people alive, brothers, hang the skins on city walls as warnings. I have seen this with my own eyes. A chill settled over the group that had nothing to do with the morning cold. One tribe alone cannot stand against them, said another man, his voice heavy with resignation. We are not farmers with walls and cities. We move, we survive. This is how it has always been, perhaps, replied an elderly chief named Freyorts. That is why we have always been defeated. Divide the horses, and even wolves can kill them. Unite the herd, and even lions must think twice. This simple metaphor contained a revolutionary idea. What if the Iranian tribes, who had spent centuries fighting among themselves, competing for grazing lands and trade rights, what if they united? What if they became one people with one purpose? The idea was not immediately popular. Nomadic peoples value their independence, their tribal identities, their freedom to move and act as they see fit. The thought of bowing to a single king, of sacrificing autonomy for security, went against everything in their cultural DNA. But the Assyrian threat was real and growing, and sometimes the only way to preserve freedom is to temporarily surrender a portion of it. The Median unification began under Deioces, whom later generations would call the first true Iranian emperor. I watched him work, this shrewd and calculating man, as he wove together the disparate tribes through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriage alliances, and, when necessary, force. My grandfather fought with Deioces in the Eastern campaigns, a warrior told me years later, his voice filled with pride. We sat in a newly built Median city, the very existence of which would have been unthinkable just a generation prior. He said the king could shoot an arrow through an apple at 50 paces while riding at full gallop. My grandmother could do that while churning butter, someone called back, provoking laughter from the assembled crowd. Tall tales aside, Deioces accomplished something remarkable. He convinced nomadic warriors to contribute labor to building a capital city, Ecbatana, high in the mountains. The very act of building a permanent capital represented a fundamental shift in identity. They were no longer simply nomads passing through the land. They were claiming it, making it theirs, planting roots that would grow into an empire. I walked through Ecbatana in its early days. The city was not yet grand. That would come later, but it pulsed with an energy I had rarely felt. These were people who knew they were creating something new, something that might outlast their brief lives and extend into a future they could barely imagine. Under Cyaxares, grandson of Deioces, the Median expansion accelerated. But more importantly, Cyaxares forged an alliance that would change the face of the ancient world. He united with the Babylonians against the common Assyrian enemy. The campaign against Nineveh, the heart of the Assyrian Empire, came in 612 years before the Christian era. I was there, dear listener. I have witnessed many battles, seen many cities fall, but few moments in history carried the emotional weight of Nineveh's destruction. The combined forces of Medes and Babylonians surrounded the city in late summer. The siege lasted months, and with each passing week, I could feel the psychological shift occurring not just in the besiegers, but throughout the ancient world. Nineveh had seemed invincible, eternal. The Assyrian military machine had terrorized the region for centuries. To see it falter, to watch the seemingly omnipotent empire struggle, was to witness the very foundations of the known world beginning to crack. My father was there when Nineveh fell. An old trader told me years later, his eyes distant with memory. He said the city burned for 3 days, smoke so thick it turned day to night. The screams, ... double quotes. He trailed off, lost in a past he had not witnessed, but had inherited nonetheless. When Nineveh finally fell, when its walls were breached and its defenders overwhelmed, a cry went up that seemed to shake the very sky. Centuries of fear, of oppression, of brutal Assyrian dominance, all of it released in that single moment of victory. But I remember something else too. Among the celebrating soldiers, I saw a Median priest standing apart, watching the burning city with an expression not of triumph, but of sorrow. "Why do you look sad?" I asked him. "Your people have won a great victory. The terror of the Assyrians is broken." He turned to me, his face illuminated by the distant flames. "Today we celebrate. Tomorrow we become what we destroyed. Such is the way of power. The conquered become conquerors. The oppressed become oppressors. The wheel turns, and we tell ourselves that this time it will be different. But it never is it?" His words haunted me then, and haunt me still. The destruction of Nineveh marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Iranian peoples, Medes, Persians, Parthians, now dominated the region. The future belonged to them. But within the Median Empire itself, tensions were already brewing. For while the Medes had achieved political dominance, they were not the only Iranian people with ambitions. To the south, in the province of Fars, from which would eventually derive the name Persia, another Iranian group was quietly growing in power and confidence. They were vassals of the Medes, paying tribute and acknowledging Median supremacy, but they remembered their own glory days, their own independent kingdom, and they chafed under foreign rule, even when that rule came from fellow Iranians. And into this volatile situation was born a child who would become something far more than a king. He would become legend, myth, the archetype of the righteous ruler. His name was Cyrus, though history would add a title, the Great. I first saw him when he was perhaps 16 summers old, already tall and commanding in bearing despite his youth. He had been summoned to the Median capital by his grandfather, who was then the Median king. I watched the young man walk through the palace corridors, his eyes taking in everything, the wealth, the power, the casual arrogance of those who had ruled for so long they believed their position unassailable. "Impressive, is it not?" asked a Median courtier, gesturing expansively at the decorated halls. The servants hurrying about their duties, the obvious displays of wealth and might. "This is what true power looks like, young prince. Remember it well." Cyrus smiled politely, but I saw something in his eyes, a calculation, an assessment. He was not admiring the power of the Median throne. He was studying it, understanding it, preparing to take it for himself. In 553 years before the Christian era, Cyrus rebelled. The decision stunned the known world. He was a vassal king, subordinate to the Median emperor. By all reasonable calculation, his rebellion should have been swiftly crushed, and Cyrus himself should have ended his days as a cautionary tale about the folly of overreaching ambition. Except that is not what happened. The Median king, Astyages, sent his most trusted general, Harpagus, to crush the rebellion. But Harpagus had his own grievances against Astyages, his own reasons for discontent. When the two armies met on the field of battle, instead of fighting, Harpagus and a significant portion of the Median army defected to Cyrus. The generals switched sides. You might ask, dear listener, disbelief in your voice, just like that. Indeed, just like that. Though of course, nothing in politics is ever quite so simple. Years of resentment, of slights and insults, of promises broken and loyalty unrewarded, all of it came to a head in that single moment of decision. Within months, Cyrus was not the rebel vassal king, but the master of the Median Empire. He took what had been given to the Medes and made it greater. He took their dreams and expanded them beyond anything they had imagined. And he did so not primarily through conquest, though conquest would come, but through something far more rare and precious. He offered vision. I know what you are thinking. Cyrus addressed his newly acquired Median subjects in a great assembly. His voice carried across the gathered thousands, and I marveled at the mixture of confidence and humility in his tone. You think, here is another conqueror, another man who will take what is yours and give nothing in return. But I say this to you, I am no conqueror. I am your brother, born of Iranian blood as you were born. Together, united, we can become something the world has never seen. Not Medes alone, not Persians alone, but Iranians, united in purpose and destiny. It was a masterful speech, and it accomplished something remarkable. It transformed a military conquest into a political unification. The Medes did not become a conquered people, but partners in a new enterprise. Cyrus kept Median officials in positions of authority, honored Median customs and traditions, and presented himself not as a Persian overlord, but as a unifying figure transcending tribal identities. He understands something the others do not, observed an elderly Median administrator who had chosen to serve the new regime. We sat in his garden one evening, sipping wine as the sun set over Ecbatana. Power taken by force must be maintained by force. Power given freely, earned through respect and vision, that power multiplies itself. Every man who serves Cyrus willingly becomes an extension of his strength. We are not his slaves, we are his partners, and Cyrus was only beginning. In 547 years before the Christian era, he turned his attention westward, toward the kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia. The Lydian king, Croesus, was renowned throughout the ancient world for his wealth, so much so that his name became synonymous with riches. Rich as Croesus, people would say, and everyone understood the meaning. Croesus made a fatal mistake. He consulted the oracle at Delphi, asking whether he should make war on the Persians. The oracle responded with typical ambiguity. If you cross the Halys River and attack the Persians, you will destroy a great empire. Encouraged by this prophecy, Croesus marched to war. Only after his defeat did he understand the oracle's cruel wisdom. The great empire he destroyed was his own. I watched the Lydian capital of Sardis fall to Persian forces. The city's defenders fought bravely, but they were facing something they did not understand. The Persian army was not simply a collection of warriors. It was a sophisticated military machine, combining different types of troops in coordinated tactics, supplied through an efficient logistics system, led by commanders who had been trained and promoted based on merit rather than birth alone. It is not fair, complained a captured Lydian officer as he sat in chains awaiting his fate. His voice carried the petulance of one who had never truly faced adversity before. We had the walls. We had the warriors. We had wealth enough to hire any mercenary army in the world. How did we lose? Because, I answered him gently, you fought for gold. They fight for something gold cannot buy, a vision of what they might become together. But what truly distinguished Cyrus was not how he won his victories, but what he did afterward. When Sardis fell, Croesus expected to be executed. That was the custom of the age, the way conquering kings treated defeated rivals. Instead, Cyrus spared his life, treated him with respect, and even sought his counsel on matters of governance and finance. "Why do you show me mercy?" Croesus asked, genuinely bewildered by this unexpected clemency. Cyrus' answer would define his legacy, because mercy is strength, and cruelty is weakness. The king who rules through fear dies with the fear, but the king who rules through respect lives on in the hearts of his people, long after his body has returned to dust. These were not empty words. Cyrus meant them, lived them, built an empire upon them. Between 545 and 540 years before the Christian era, Cyrus expanded eastward, bringing Bactria and Sogdiana under Persian control. These regions, in what is now Afghanistan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan, were vital to securing the empire's eastern frontiers against the nomadic peoples who still roamed the vast steppes beyond. But the crown jewel of Cyrus' conquests, the achievement that would immortalize his name, came in 539 years before the Christian era. Babylon, the very name resonated with power and history. Babylon was ancient when the Persians were still nomads, wandering the grasslands. Its hanging gardens were counted among the wonders of the world. Its walls were so massive that chariots could race along their tops. Its temples were filled with treasures accumulated over millennia. And its people had a cultural pride that made them nearly impossible to govern. Nearly impossible, but not for Cyrus. I stood among the crowds as the Persian army entered Babylon, and I witnessed something I had never seen before and have rarely seen since. A city that welcomed its conqueror as a liberator. The Babylonians cheered when we entered. An old Persian soldier would recall decades later, still shaking his head in disbelief at the memory. Threw flowers at our horses. Never seen anything like it in 40 years of warfare. Usually we're dodging arrows, not flowers. How did Cyrus accomplish this miracle? Through a combination of brilliant propaganda and genuine respect for Babylonian culture and religion. Before the conquest, he had sent agents into the city, spreading word that he came not as a destroyer, but as a restorer of proper religious observance, which had been neglected by the current Babylonian king. When Cyrus entered the city, his first act was to go to the temple of Marduk, the chief Babylonian god, and make offerings according to Babylonian ritual. He proclaimed himself not the conqueror of Babylon, but its rightful king, chosen by Marduk himself to restore order and justice. He walked into the temple of Marduk and made offerings according to our customs, marveled a Babylonian priest, describing the scene to me years later. His aged hands trembled as he poured wine for us both. Then he visited the temple of the Jewish god and did the same. He said, "All gods deserve respect, even those of conquered peoples." Can you imagine? After what we suffered under our previous king, who cared nothing for proper observance, Cyrus seemed like a gift from heaven itself. But Cyrus' most famous act in Babylon was yet to come. The Jews had been held in Babylonian captivity for decades. Ever since Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem and exiled its population. They were slaves, though perhaps not in the harshest sense of the word. More like second-class subjects, dreaming of a homeland they could barely remember. Cyrus issued a decree. The Jews were free to return to their homeland, to rebuild their temple, to re-establish their nation. Moreover, he would fund the reconstruction from the imperial treasury. I was in the Jewish quarter when news of the decree arrived. The sound that rose up was unlike anything I had heard before. Thousands of voices lifted in prayer, in song, in weeping. Old men who had been born in exile, who had never seen Jerusalem, who had believed they would die in a foreign land, fell to their knees and praised their God for sending them a deliverer who was not even one of us, marveled a young Jewish scribe, tears streaming down his face. A Persian king who worships different gods, who has no obligation to us at all. Yet he frees us when our own kings could not, when our own God seemed to have abandoned us. How do we understand this? How do we explain it? The Hebrew Bible would solve this theological puzzle by declaring Cyrus a Messiah, literally anointed one, the only non-Jewish figure ever to receive this designation. It was an extraordinary honor, a recognition that sometimes God's purposes are accomplished through the most unexpected instruments. But for Cyrus, the calculus was both spiritual and practical. Yes, he believed in respecting the gods of conquered peoples, in tolerating different faiths and customs. But he also understood that grateful subjects are loyal subjects, that people who feel respected will fight to defend the empire that respects them, and that diversity could be a source of strength rather than weakness if properly managed. Diversity makes us stronger, Cyrus declared in an address to his assembled advisors. A mix of Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Elamites, and others. I sat in the back of the hall, listening. When everyone thinks the same, sees the same, believes the same, then we are vulnerable to the same weaknesses. But when we bring together different peoples, different perspectives, different skills, we become resilient, we become adaptable, we become unconquerable. To formalize these principles, Cyrus issued what some historians consider the world's first declaration of human rights, the Cyrus Cylinder. This clay cylinder, inscribed in cuneiform script, proclaimed religious freedom, the right of conquered peoples to return to their homelands, and the duty of the king to rule justly over all his subjects, regardless of their ethnicity or faith. This text was translated into every language of the empire, explained a scribe who worked on the translations. He showed me copies in Elamite, Akkadian, Aramaic, and a dozen other scripts. From one end of the empire to the other, everyone could read in their own tongue the principles by which the King of Kings promised to rule. It was unprecedented indeed. And more than that, it was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, an empire was built not on the suppression of difference, but on its celebration. Not on forcing everyone to become Persian, but on allowing them to remain themselves, while also becoming participants in a larger, shared project. By 533 years before the Christian era, Cyrus had forged the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from the Mediterranean to the Indus River, from Central Asia to Egypt's borders. Approximately 44% of the world's population lived under Persian rule, a staggering concentration of human beings under a single political authority. But size alone does not make an empire great. What made Cyrus' empire remarkable was how it was governed. He divided the realm into provinces called satrapies, each ruled by a satrap who had considerable autonomy in local matters, but who answered ultimately to the king. To ensure these powerful governors did not become too independent, Cyrus established a network of inspectors known as the King's Eyes and Ears, who traveled the empire, observing, reporting, keeping the king informed of everything that transpired in his vast domain. Trust, but verify, a Persian official explained to me, summarizing the system with admirable brevity. The satraps are trusted to govern wisely and well, but they are also watched, always, to ensure that trust is not misplaced. Cyrus also established a sophisticated communication system. At regular intervals along the major roads, stations were built where fresh horses, food, water, and shelter awaited imperial messengers. A courier could travel from one end of the empire to the other in a fraction of the time it would take an ordinary traveler, ensuring that news, orders, and information flowed quickly and efficiently. "Best job in the empire," grinned a young courier, stretching his legs after a hard ride from Susa to Ecbatana. He was covered in dust, but smiling nonetheless. "See the world, sleep in clean beds, eat good food. Beats being a foot soldier any day, though the saddle sores are a killer." This system was so effective that it persisted, with modifications, for over 1,000 years. Successive empires, Seleucid, Parthian, Sasanian, even the early Islamic caliphates, maintained essentially the same structure that Cyrus had established, a testament to its fundamental soundness. But all mortal things must end, and even the greatest of kings must eventually face death. Cyrus died in 530 years before the Christian era, possibly in battle against nomadic tribes in Central Asia, possibly from disease or accident. The sources disagree. What matters is that he died as he had lived, in the service of his empire, working to secure its borders and ensure its future. His body was brought back to his homeland in Fars, to the city of Pasargadae he had founded. There, a simple tomb was built, simple, at least, by the standards of ancient kings. No massive pyramid, no elaborate underground complex, just a small stone chamber on a stepped platform, surrounded by a garden. I visited that tomb many times over the centuries that followed. Each time, I was struck by its modesty. Here lay the man who had conquered the known world, who had created history's first global empire, who had been worshipped as a god by some of his subjects. And yet his final resting place was marked not by grandiosity, but by dignified simplicity. An inscription was carved above the entrance, written in the first person, as if Cyrus himself were addressing those who came to pay their respects. "O man, whoever you are and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who won the Persians their empire. Do not therefore begrudge me this little earth that covers my body. This little earth that covers my body." Such humility from such a mighty king. It was, I thought, the perfect final statement from a man who had understood that empires rise and fall, that glory is fleeting, that all flesh returns to dust. But ideas are different. Ideas can live forever, passed from one generation to the next, growing stronger rather than weaker with age. And the ideas Cyrus embodied tolerance, justice, respect for diversity, the belief that strength lies in mercy and unity in difference. These ideas would outlive him by millennia. They would influence civilizations that had not yet been born, inspire leaders who would arise centuries after his death, and plant seeds of thought that would eventually flower into concepts like human rights and religious freedom that we take for granted in the modern world. As the sun set over Pasargadae that evening, I stood by Cyrus' tomb and reflected on what I had witnessed. An empire had been born unlike any that had come before it. A template had been created for how diverse peoples might live together under a single authority while maintaining their distinct identities. A vision had been articulated of what kingship could be, not simply the exercise of power, but the fulfillment of responsibility. The stars emerged, one by one, in the darkening sky, the same stars that had guided Cyrus on his campaigns, that had witnessed his triumphs and his struggles, that would continue to wheel overhead long after his empire had crumbled to dust. But the light they reflected had taken years to reach the earth. The stars we see are not as they are now, but as they were in the distant past. Their light is memory, traveling across vast darkness to illuminate the present. So too with great men and great deeds. Cyrus was gone, but his light would continue to shine, would continue to illuminate the path for those who came after, would continue to remind humanity of what was possible when power was tempered with wisdom and might was married to mercy. The Persian Empire had found its founder. Now it would find its full flowering. The dawn of kings had come. The age of glory was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Height of Heaven. When Persepolis rose and the world bowed. The morning I first saw Persepolis, the city was still being born. Scaffolding covered the massive columns that would one day support ceremonial halls. Thousands of workers, Egyptians, Babylonians, Ionians, Bactrians, bringing their unique skills and artistic traditions, labored under the desert sun, creating something unprecedented in human history. The year was approximately 515 years before the Christian era. Cyrus had been dead for 15 years. His son, Cambyses, had conquered Egypt and then died under mysterious circumstances. And now a new king sat upon the Persian throne, Darius, who would be called the Great by history, though in truth he was usurper who had seized power through a combination of military force and political cunning. Every stone was brought from the mountains, explained a supervisor, gesturing broadly at the construction site. His hands were calloused from years of work, his face weathered by sun and wind. Every beam of cedar from Lebanon, artists from Egypt, craftsmen from Babylon, laborers from a dozen nations, 30 years of work, and still we build. This will be the wonder of the world when it is complete. He was not exaggerating. Persepolis, the Greek name meaning city of the Persians, was designed not as a practical capital for daily governance, but as a ceremonial center, a stage upon which the Persian Empire would perform its power for an audience of the entire world. I watched as a massive column capital, carved in the shape of paired bulls, was slowly raised into position. Dozens of men pulled on ropes, their chants synchronizing their efforts, while engineers supervised every movement with meticulous care. One mistake, one miscalculation, and months of work would shatter on the stone platform below. "Why bulls?" I asked, a Persian engineer who stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the operation with intense focus. He glanced at me, then back at the capital. "Strength," he said simply. "Bulls represent power, virility, the life force itself. But see how they are paired. Two bulls facing opposite directions, back to back. This represents the empire, powerful in all directions, always watchful, never vulnerable to attack from behind. Every element of Persepolis was laden with such symbolism. The city sat on an enormous stone platform, raised high above the plain, the King of Kings elevated above common earth. A grand stairway, wide enough for horses to ascend side by side, led to the main platform, and carved into the sides of this stairway were representatives of the 23 nations that comprised the empire, each bearing gifts appropriate to their homeland. "See here," said a master sculptor, pointing to a relief he had just completed. It showed a delegation of Bactrians, identifiable by their distinctive camel trains. Each nation is depicted with respect, shown in their native dress, carrying their characteristic gifts. The Bactrians with camels, the Lydians with gold, the Indians with spices, all acknowledging the King of Kings, yet all depicted with dignity. This was crucial to understanding Persian imperial ideology. The subject peoples were not shown as defeated slaves or crushed enemies. They were portrayed as participants in the empire, bringing their unique contributions to a larger whole. It was propaganda, certainly, but propaganda that reflected a genuine philosophical approach to governance. At the top of the platform stood the Apadana, the great audience hall, where the king received foreign delegations and held official ceremonies. Its roof was supported by 72 columns, each 65 feet high. Walking into that space, even while it was still under construction, felt like entering a forest of stone, except no forest on earth had ever possessed such symmetry, such grandeur, such obvious human ambition. "Stand here," directed a court official, positioning me at the entrance to the Apadana. "See how the space draws your eye inward, how the columns frame the throne at the far end, how the proportions make the king seem larger than life without resorting to crude distortion. This is Persian innovation, using architecture to reinforce the cosmic order, the rightful place of the King of Kings as the representative of Ahura Mazda on earth. But who was this Darius, who had ordered such magnificence built? And how had he come to power? The story begins with Cambyses II, son of Cyrus, who had expanded the empire by conquering Egypt. But while Cambyses was in Egypt, a mysterious figure named Gomata claimed to be Cambyses' younger brother, Berdia, and seized the throne in Persia. Cambyses died while hurrying back to confront this usurper. Some sources say by suicide, others suggest murder or accident. Into this chaos stepped Darius, a cousin of Cambyses and member of a collateral branch of the royal family. Along with 6 other Persian nobles, he led a conspiracy to overthrow Gomata. According to Darius's own account, carved into the cliff face at Behistun, Gomata was an impostor, a Magian priest who had falsely claimed royal blood. Whether this was true or merely convenient propaganda, we will never know for certain. What we do know is that after killing Gomata, the 7 conspirators met to decide the future of the empire. Darius later claimed that they agreed to let chance decide who would be king. Whoever's horse neighed first at sunrise would take the throne. Darius' groom, through trickery, ensured that Darius' horse performed on cue. "Kings are made by horses as often as by gods," muttered a cynical old courtier when he told me this story years later. Never trust an official account of how power was seized. The victors always claim divine sanction and popular support. What actually happened? Violence, treachery, luck, and the willingness to do what others would not, perhaps. But regardless of how he came to power, Darius proved to be a ruler of extraordinary capability. Upon assuming the throne, he faced rebellions throughout the empire, 19 separate uprisings in the first year of his rule alone, led by men who saw opportunity in the chaos of succession. Darius crushed them all, and then, in an act of either supreme confidence or monumental arrogance, he had the entire story carved into a cliff face at Behistun, complete with his own narration of events. This massive inscription, written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, and featuring a relief sculpture showing Darius triumphant over 9 rebel leaders, served multiple purposes. I traveled to Behistun to see the inscription when it was newly completed. The cliff face rose sheer and imposing above the ancient road, and the inscription was carved so high that one had to crane one's neck painfully to see it. This was deliberate. The message was meant to be literally above common humanity, a statement from the King of Kings to all who passed below. 3 languages, explained a scribe who had worked on the inscription. We sat in the shade of an acacia tree, drinking water and resting from the climb to the carving site. Old Persian, because it is the language of the ruling people. Elamite, because it is the administrative language we inherited from the ancient empires. Babylonian, because it is understood throughout Mesopotamia. Every subject of the empire can read the king's words in a language they understand. The inscription itself was remarkable, one of the longest and most detailed texts from the ancient world. It told the story of Darius' accession, of how he defeated the rebels who rose against him, of how he restored order and justice to the empire. It praised Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of the Zoroastrian faith, for guiding and protecting the rightful king. By the grace of Ahura Mazda, I am king, the inscription proclaimed. Ahura Mazda bestowed the kingdom upon me. What was said by me, I did, by the grace of Ahura Mazda. But the Behistun inscription was more than propaganda. It would later prove invaluable to modern scholars, serving as the key that unlocked the ancient cuneiform scripts, just as the Rosetta Stone allowed the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics. The Behistun inscription's trilingual text enabled historians to decode the languages of ancient Mesopotamia. We build not just for ourselves, Darius once said, according to accounts that reached me through his courtiers, but for posterity. Long after our bones have turned to dust, these stones will speak our truth to generations yet unborn. He was right, though I doubt he imagined just how distant those future generations would be. Under Darius, the Persian Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. He pushed into India, conquering the Indus Valley. He expanded into Thrace and Macedonia in Europe. He secured Egypt, which had rebelled after Cambyses' death. At its peak, the empire covered approximately 5,500,000 square kilometers, larger than the entire European Union would be more than 2 millennia later. But Darius' genius lay not in conquest alone, but in administration. He inherited Cyrus's vision of a diverse, tolerant empire, and created the systems to make that vision sustainable across generations. The empire was formally divided into 20 satrapies, each with clear boundaries, defined responsibilities, and standardized tax obligations. Each satrap ruled his province with considerable autonomy, but was watched by royal inspectors, by secretaries who reported directly to the king, and by military commanders who operated independently of the satrap's authority. Checks and balances, explained a royal administrator, using a phrase that would not become common in political theory for thousands of years, but which perfectly described the Persian system. No single man controls too much. The satrap governs, but the military commander controls the army. The secretary manages finances and reports to the king. The inspector travels freely, watching everyone. Power is divided so that ambition is checked. Darius also standardized the empire's monetary system, introducing gold darics and silver sigloi as imperial coinage. This innovation revolutionized trade and taxation throughout the realm. Before, every city had its own weights, its own measures, its own money. A merchant explained to me in the bustling market of Susa. He spread before me coins from across the empire, darics bearing the image of the king as archer, sigloi stamped with imperial symbols. Trade was chaos, converting values, arguing over weights, never certain if you were being cheated. Now, I take a daric in Sardis, spend it in Bactria, and everyone knows its value. The king's face guarantees it. Commerce has never been easier. The roads, too, were improved and expanded under Darius. The royal road, running from Sardis in the west to Susa in the east, became the empire's central artery, nearly 1,700 miles long. It featured stations every 15 miles where messengers could find fresh horses, food, and shelter. Neither snow nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night stays these couriers from the swift completion of their appointed rounds. Observed the Greek historian Herodotus with admiration, describing the Persian postal system. This phrase would later be adapted as the unofficial motto of postal services in many nations, a testament to Persian efficiency that lasted far longer than the empire itself. I traveled the royal road many times over the centuries. Even in its early days under Darius, it was a marvel of engineering and organization. Bridges spanned rivers. Stone markers indicated distances. Caravanserais offered shelter to merchants and travelers. Patrols kept the roads safe from bandits. The journey that would take an ordinary traveler 3 months could be completed by royal messengers in 7 days. This is what separates us from barbarians, declared a Persian official proudly, gesturing at a well-maintained section of road. Anyone can conquer. The Assyrians conquered, the Babylonians conquered, but we build, we connect, we make the empire not just lines on a map, but a living system where goods, people, ideas flow freely. This is civilization. Yet for all his administrative genius, Darius faced a challenge that would haunt the Persian Empire for generations. The Greeks. The trouble began in 499 years before the Christian era, when Greek cities in Ionia, western Anatolia, rebelled against Persian rule. Athens and Eretria, cities in mainland Greece, sent ships and soldiers to support the rebellion. Together, the rebels burned Sardis, the Persian regional capital, including its sacred temples. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but Darius never forgave the Greek interference. Athens, in particular, became an obsession. Darius raged when news of the burning reached him. I was present in the throne room, standing among the courtiers as the king received the report. His face darkened with fury. Athens dares to burn my city, to defile my temples, to support rebellion against the King of Kings. Every day, let someone remind me, Master, remember the Athenians. And so it became custom. At every meal, a servant would approach the king and say, Master, remember the Athenians. It was a ritual of remembered grievance, a vow of eventual vengeance. In 492 years before the Christian era, Darius launched his first invasion of Greece. The campaign began well, with Persian forces subduing Thrace and Macedonia, But then disaster struck. A storm off Mount Athos destroyed much of the Persian fleet, and without naval support, the invasion stalled. Darius was not deterred. 2 years later, he tried again, the second invasion, in 490 years before the Christian era, was more focused. The Persian fleet sailed directly across the Aegean, landed at Marathon, just northeast of Athens, and prepared to march on the city itself. The battle that followed has become legend. The Athenian army, numbering perhaps 10,000 men, faced a Persian force twice their size. By all reasonable calculation, the Greeks should have been annihilated. But the Athenians did something unexpected. Rather than waiting for the Persians to attack, they charged. They ran across the plain at Marathon, covering nearly a mile at speed, and smashed into the Persian lines before the famed Persian archers could fully deploy. They just kept coming, a Persian survivor told me, his eyes still wide with shock years after the battle. His hands trembled as he poured wine, spilling some on the table. Our arrows blackened the sky, but they didn't stop. They ran straight into our lines, wearing their bronze armor, screaming their war cries. I've never seen such madness, or such courage. The battle was brutal and confused. The Persian center actually broke through the Athenian line, but the Greek wings wheeled inward, surrounding the Persian forces. By day's end, over 6,000 Persians lay dead on the plain of Marathon, while Athenian losses numbered only 192 men. The psychological impact was even greater than the military defeat. For the first time, the seemingly invincible Persian army had been decisively beaten in open battle. The myth of Persian invincibility, carefully cultivated through decades of conquest, shattered on that Greek plain. How do we return to Susa and explain this? An officer asked in the aftermath. As the shattered remains of the invasion force regrouped, how do we tell the King of Kings that a handful of Greek farmers defeated the finest army in the world? They did tell him, of course. They had no choice, and Darius, rather than accepting defeat, began planning an even larger invasion. This time, he would lead it himself. This time, there would be no mistakes. But Darius never got his chance for revenge. In 486 years before the Christian era, he died, leaving the Persian throne to his son Xerxes. I attended Darius' funeral at Nakshi-Rostam, where his tomb had been carved into the cliff face near Persepolis. Unlike Cyrus' simple sepulchre, Darius' tomb was grand, featuring a massive relief showing the king standing on a platform supported by representatives of subject nations. Above him, Ahura Mazda blessed the rightful king. He changed everything, an old courtier whispered as we watched the funeral procession. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks, cutting tracks through the dust. When Darius took the throne, the empire was in chaos, rebellions everywhere, the future uncertain. He gave us order, stability, prosperity, the roads we travel, the coins we spend, the laws we follow, all his work. How does one replace such a man? The question hung unanswered in the air. Xerxes, Darius's son and chosen successor, was in many ways the image of his father, tall, commanding, educated in the arts of kingship from childhood. But he inherited his father's obsession with Greece, and that obsession would define his reign. In 480 years before the Christian era, Xerxes launched the largest military expedition the ancient world had ever seen. Modern historians debate the exact numbers. Ancient sources claim millions, but this is almost certainly exaggerated. But the force was undeniably massive. Soldiers from every corner of the empire, Persians, Medes, Elamites, Babylonians, Egyptians, Indians, Bactrians, Scythians, and dozens of other peoples. I watched them assemble, a quartermaster told me, shaking his head at the memory. We sat in a tavern in Sardis, years after the campaign. For weeks they kept coming. Different languages, different weapons, different gods, all united under the King of Kings, feeding them alone. Do you have any idea how much food that requires? 400,000 pounds of grain every single day. The logistics were a nightmare. Xerxes even ordered the construction of a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, the strait separating Asia from Europe. Engineers lashed together hundreds of ships, laid planks across them, covered the planks with earth and brush, and created a roadway nearly a mile long when a storm destroyed the first attempt. Xerxes, in a display of hubris that shocked even his own people, ordered that the Hellespont be given 300 lashes as punishment, and that a pair of fetters be thrown into the water to symbolize the CS enslavement. "The king whips the ocean," muttered a Persian engineer who witnessed this spectacle. His tone mixed horror and dark amusement, as if the waves care about royal displeasure, as if nature itself will bow to the King of Kings. This is not confidence, this is madness, perhaps. But the bridge was rebuilt, and for 7 days and 7 nights, the Persian army crossed from Asia into Europe. The greatest military force ever assembled was marching to war. The early stages of the campaign went well. Persian forces swept through northern Greece, and many Greek cities surrendered without fighting. The famous Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans and several thousand other Greeks held a narrow pass against the Persian army for 3 days, ended in Persian victory despite heavy losses. I was there at Thermopylae, standing among the Persian ranks as we finally broke through the Greek position. The Spartans fought to the last man, their red cloaks soaked darker with blood, their spears finding Persian flesh even as they died. It was the bravest thing I had ever witnessed, and also the most futile. "They could have retreated," a Persian officer said, bewildered by the Spartan sacrifice. "They could have lived to fight another day. Why throw away lives for a position that cannot be held?" "Because," answered an older Greek mercenary fighting in the Persian army, his voice heavy with something I could not quite identify. "They were buying time for their cities to prepare. They were making a statement, and they were showing their gods that Spartans do not run, do not surrender, do not compromise. Even in death, especially in death, they were victorious." After Thermopylae, Athens itself was captured and burned, perhaps in revenge for the burning of Sardis years earlier. But this Pyrrhic victory would prove costly. The crucial moment came at Salamis, where the Persian fleet encountered the Greek navy in the narrow straits between the island and the mainland. Xerxes had a throne erected on the shore so he could watch his fleet destroy the Greeks. He watched destruction, certainly, but it was his own fleet that was destroyed. The Greeks, led by the cunning Athenian commander Themistocles, lured the much larger Persian fleet into the narrow waters, where numbers became a disadvantage. The Persian ships crowded together, unable to maneuver, were picked apart by the more agile Greek triremes. It was chaos. A Persian naval officer who survived told me, his voice hollow with trauma. Pure chaos. Ships ramming into each other, our own ships, not the enemy's. Men drowning in armor, too heavy to swim in. The Greeks moving like sharks through the confusion, ramming, withdrawing, ramming again. And above it all, the king watching from his throne, seeing his great fleet torn apart. Xerxes returned to Asia soon after, leaving his general Mardonius to continue the war. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the remaining Persian land forces were decisively defeated. The invasion of Greece was over, and it had failed. 4 years of preparation, sighed a treasury official in Susa, reviewing the accounts of the Greek campaign. The wealth of an empire poured into this venture, and for what? A handful of poor Greek cities remain independent. Our army has suffered its worst defeats in history, and the myth of Persian invincibility lies shattered. The cost is ... incalculable. For the Persians, the Greek wars were an expensive failure, but not a catastrophic one. The empire remained the greatest power on earth, controlling more territory and people than any other state. Life in the heartland continued largely unchanged. But for the Greeks, these victories became foundational myths. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, these battles entered Greek consciousness as proof that free citizens fighting for their homes could defeat the tyrannical hordes of despotic Persia. The contrast between Greek freedom and Persian slavery, between Western democracy and Eastern despotism, became central to how Greeks defined themselves. This was largely propaganda, of course. The Persian Empire was not the tyrannical despotism that Greek historians described, and the Greek city-states were hardly bastions of universal freedom. Slavery was common. Women had few rights, and many Greeks lived under oligarchies or tyrants rather than democracies. But propaganda shapes history as surely as reality does, perhaps more so. The Greek narrative of their wars with Persia would influence Western thought for millennia, creating stereotypes about East and West that persist to this day. They write us as villains in their stories, observed a Persian scholar who had read the Greek historians. We sat in a garden in Susa, surrounded by roses and the sound of fountains. Herodotus describes our customs as if we were exotic curiosities, half-civilized barbarians ruled by mad tyrants. He acknowledges our achievements only to make Greek victories seem more impressive. Do they not realize that we see them the same way, as fractious, disorganized barbarians who cannot even maintain peace among their own cities? Yet, despite the mutual incomprehension and hostility, Greek and Persian cultures influenced each other in profound ways. Greek mercenaries served in Persian armies. Persian gold funded Greek political factions. Greek art incorporated Persian motifs. Persian administrative techniques impressed Greek political theorists. The relationship was complex, combining elements of enmity, respect, fear, and fascination in equal measure. As the 5th century, before the Christian era progressed, the Persian Empire settled into a kind of equilibrium, no longer expanding, occasionally troubled by rebellions or palace intrigues, but fundamentally stable and prosperous. Trade flourished along the royal roads. Cities grew and thrived. Art and architecture reached new heights of sophistication. I spent time in Persepolis during its golden age, when it was complete and fully operational. During the spring equinox, when the Persian New Year was celebrated, representatives from across the empire gathered to present tribute to the king. The ceremony was spectacular. One by one, delegations ascended the great stairway, each group wearing the distinctive dress of their homeland, carrying the unique products of their region. Egyptians with linen and papyrus, Babylonians with exotic animals, Indians with ivory and spices, Bactrians with precious metals, Ionians with textiles, and on, a living demonstration of the empire's diversity and the king's universal authority. "What other king can claim such loyalty?" asked a Persian courtier, gesturing at the assembled delegations. Pride suffused his voice. From sunrise to sunset, from the frozen steppes to the burning deserts, all acknowledge the King of Kings. This is not mere conquest. This is cosmic order made manifest. The later kings lacked the vigor and vision of Cyrus and Darius. Court intrigues consumed energy that should have been directed outward. Satraps grew increasingly independent, sometimes treating their provinces as personal kingdoms. The central bureaucracy became bloated and corrupt. My grandfather served the great King Darius. An elderly palace servant told me one evening as we walked through the corridors of Persepolis. Torchlight flickered on the polished stone, casting shifting shadows. In those days, the king's word was law from sunrise to sunset. Tax collectors were honest. Governors feared royal inspectors. Justice was swift and certain. Now satraps delay paying tribute. Subject peoples grumble. The court itself has become a nest of vipers, each faction plotting against the others. His assessment was harsh, but not inaccurate. The mechanisms that Cyrus and Darius had created still functioned, but they operated with less efficiency, less integrity, less sense of shared purpose. Yet even in this period of gradual decline, the Persian Empire remained magnificent. Its cities were centers of culture and commerce. Its roads facilitated trade across continents. Its administrative systems kept millions of people fed, protected, and relatively prosperous. For ordinary subjects, life under Persian rule was generally better than under most alternatives. As the sun set over Persepolis that evening, turning the stone columns to gold and rose, I stood on the great platform and looked out over the plain below. Campfires sparkled like reflected stars as the gathered delegations prepared their evening meals. The sound of multiple languages, a babel of tongues, drifted up to where I stood. This was what empire meant, I realized. Not just conquest, not just power, but this, bringing together peoples who would never otherwise meet, facilitating exchange across impossible distances, creating systems that allowed millions to live and work and dream together. It was beautiful, it was fragile, and it was doomed. For even as Persepolis stood at the height of its glory, celebrating its power and majesty, far to the west a force was gathering that would bring it all crashing down. A young king from Macedonia, tutored by Aristotle, obsessed with the heroes of Greek myth, was preparing to accomplish what Athens and Sparta had never managed, the complete conquest of the Persian Empire. His name was Alexander, and he was coming. Chapter 5. The Dying Light. When empire fell, and Phoenix stirred in ash, the dust rose in clouds, thick enough to choke, kicked up by thousands upon thousands of marching feet. I stood on a hillside in Anatolia, watching the Macedonian army pass below, and I marveled at their efficiency, their discipline, the almost mechanical precision of their movement. The year was 334 before the Christian era. Alexander III of Macedon, barely 22 years old, had crossed the Hellespont with an army of perhaps 50,000 men and an ambition that encompassed the entire world. They say he sleeps with a copy of Homer's Iliad under his pillow. A Persian spy told his superiors after returning from Macedonia. I listened from the shadows of the palace chamber, as I have listened to so many conferences across the ages. Fancies himself a new Achilles. His father, Philip, was assassinated, probably by Alexander himself. though no one dares say it aloud. The boy is dangerous, brilliant, but dangerous. The current Persian king, Darius III, had come to the throne only 2 years earlier through palace intrigue rather than legitimate succession. He was not incompetent, but neither was he remarkable. More importantly, he faced an opponent who was very remarkable indeed. Another Greek troublemaker scoffed a Persian nobleman when news arrived of Alexander's crossing. We sat in the cool shade of a Sardis palace, drinking wine, discussing the latest threat as if it were merely another in a long series of manageable problems. The King of Kings has swatted aside dozens like him. This Alexander will be no different. This confidence would prove catastrophically misplaced. The first major confrontation came at the Granicus River in Anatolia. The Persian satraps of the region assembled their forces, substantial but not the full might of the empire, and waited for Alexander to come to them. The battle was hard fought. Alexander himself nearly died when a Persian horseman shattered his helmet with a blow that would have split his skull had a companion not intervened. But by day's end, the Persian forces were routed, and Alexander controlled the western coast of Anatolia. It was just bad luck, insisted a Persian officer who had survived the battle. Bad positioning. The local satraps mishandled the situation. When the King of Kings himself takes the field with the full imperial army, this Macedonian upstart will learn the difference between defeating provincial forces and facing true power. Perhaps he believed this. Perhaps he had to believe it, for the alternative that Persia might actually lose was too terrible to contemplate. Alexander moved swiftly, liberating, as he called it, or conquering, as the Persians saw it, the Greek cities of Ionia. Then he turned south, following the Mediterranean coast, taking city after city, building momentum, both military and psychological. The decisive confrontation between Alexander and Darius III came in 333 before the Christian era, at Issus in southern Anatolia. Darius arrived with a massive army drawn from across the empire. The exact numbers are disputed. Ancient sources claim hundreds of thousands. Modern scholars suggest perhaps 100,000. But regardless, Darius had a significant numerical advantage. Yet he made a crucial tactical error. He chose to fight in a narrow coastal plain where his numbers could not be fully deployed. It was like trying to pour an ocean through a funnel. The sheer mass of the Persian army became a liability rather than an advantage. I watched the battle from a distance, my heart heavy with foreboding. The Macedonian phalanx, that dense formation of men with impossibly long spears, advanced with mechanical precision. The Persian cavalry, among the finest in the world, charged repeatedly but could not break the disciplined Macedonian lines. And then Alexander himself, leading his elite companion cavalry, punched through the Persian line and drove straight toward where Darius commanded from his royal chariot. One moment we were holding the line, recounted a Persian infantry soldier who survived. We sat in a dusty tavern years later, and he still could not quite believe what he had witnessed. Difficult fighting, but we were holding. Then word spreads. The king has fled. The king has fled. And suddenly everyone is running. Why fight if your king won't stand with you? Whether Darius fled before the battle was truly lost or retreated to regroup is debated. What matters is the perception. The King of Kings abandoned his army, his family, his camp with all its treasures. The psychological impact was devastating. In his haste, Darius left behind his mother, wife, and daughters. Alexander, demonstrating the mercy and political savvy that made him more than just a conqueror, treated the captive royal women with extraordinary respect. He visits the Queen Mother daily, reported a Persian servant who remained with the royal family. Amazed by this unprecedented behavior, treats her with the respect to his own mother, says she is queen still, that her dignity does not depend on her son's military fortunes. Strange behavior for a conqueror. Most would have used them as hostages, bargaining chips, or worse. Alexander's generosity toward Darius' family earned him a reputation for magnanimity that softened Persian resistance in many regions. If this conqueror treated royal women with such respect, how might he treat ordinary subjects? After Issus, Alexander turned south. Instead of pursuing Darius eastward, he conquered Syria, Phoenicia, and Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator from Persian rule and proclaimed pharaoh. He founded Alexandria, which would become one of the ancient world's greatest cities. Only in 331 years before the Christian era did Alexander turn his attention back to Persia proper. Darius, given this time, had assembled a new army even larger than before and chosen a battlefield carefully, the plain of Gaugamela, where his superior numbers and feared scythed chariots would have room to operate. I stood among the Persian ranks on the morning of that battle. The army stretched across the horizon, a sea of men and horses representing every corner of the empire. Medes, Bactrians, Sogdians, Indians, Parthians, Armenians, the full might of the greatest empire on earth, assembled to crush the Macedonian invader once and for all. This time will be different, Darius assured his generals the night before battle. I listened from the shadows of the command tent. We have prepared the ground. We have space to maneuver. Our scythed chariots will tear through their lines, and their formations will collapse. Today, we end the Alexander problem. The confidence was understandable, but misplaced. The Persian scythed chariots, terrifying weapons with blades extending from their wheels to cut down infantry, proved largely ineffective against the disciplined Macedonian troops who simply opened their ranks to let the chariots pass through harmlessly. More devastating was Alexander's tactical genius. He used his cavalry to create a gap in the Persian line, then drove his elite forces through that gap directly toward Darius's position, just as he had at Issus. And once again, Darius fled. Twice spat a Persian officer who survived Gaugamela, his voice thick with contempt and despair. Twice he ran before the battle was truly decided. A king who does not stand with his men does not deserve to be king. With Darius's second flight, Persian resistance collapsed. The great cities fell one by one. Babylon surrendered without a fight, its gates opened to Alexander by inhabitants who had no love for their Persian overlords. Susa, with its vast treasury, was captured intact. And then, in January of 330 years before the Christian era, Alexander reached Persepolis, the magnificent ceremonial capital, that jewel of Persian architecture, that symbol of imperial might. It fell to Macedonian conquest. For several months, Alexander occupied Persepolis. He lived in the royal palace, studied the Persian administrative systems, began adopting elements of Persian court ceremony. Some of his Macedonian officers grumbled that he was becoming more Persian than Macedonian, that he was forgetting who he was. And then, in May, Persepolis burned. Exactly what happened that night remains controversial. Some sources blame drunken revelry that got out of hand. Others suggest it was a deliberate act of revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens 150 years earlier. Still others claim it was political calculation, destroying the symbol of Persian power to demonstrate that the old order was finished forever. "I was there that night," whispered a Persian servant who worked in the palace, his voice haunted by memory even years later. The Macedonian soldiers had been drinking for hours. Then someone, a woman, an Athenian courtesan, urged Alexander to let them burn the palace as revenge for Greece. He was drunk too. Everyone was drunk. They started with curtains, tapestries. Soon the whole palace was ablaze. By morning, centuries of history were ash. I watched Persepolis burn. The flames rose so high they seemed to touch the stars, and the heat was fierce enough to feel from a mile away. The magnificent columns, the intricate carvings, the gilded ceilings, all consumed by fire that roared like a living thing. Ironically, the fire that destroyed Persepolis also preserved it. The intense heat caused roof timbers to collapse, burying much of the palace complex under protective debris. When archaeologists excavated the site more than 2 millennia later, they would find sculptures, inscriptions, even traces of paint that had been protected by the very catastrophe that seemed to destroy them. But that was small consolation to those who watched their world burn that night. Alexander pursued Darius eastward into Central Asia, but before he could capture the Persian king, Darius was murdered by Besbus, one of his own satraps, who then proclaimed himself king. Alexander captured and executed Bessus, treating him as a regicide rather than a legitimate claimant to the throne. And Alexander gave Darius III a royal burial, honoring him as a fellow king despite being his enemy. "He weeps for Darius," reported a Macedonian soldier, bewildered by his king's grief. Says that Darius was a noble opponent who deserved a better end. Strange to mourn the man you spent years trying to kill. But Alexander was full of such contradictions. By 327 years before the Christian era, all significant resistance to his rule had been crushed. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the known world for over 2 centuries, had ceased to exist. Yet Alexander's attitude toward his conquest was complex. He did not seek to destroy Persian culture, but to incorporate it. He encouraged his officers to marry Persian noblewomen. He recruited Persians into his army and administration. He adopted Persian royal dress and ceremony. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate successor to the Persian kings, the new king of kings. "He's becoming more Persian than the Persians," grumbled a Macedonian veteran, watching Alexander hold court in full Persian regalia. "We crossed the world to defeat these people, and now our king wants us to bow to him like he's one of their god kings. This isn't what we fought for." This tension between Alexander's Macedonian followers, who wanted plunder and return home, and his vision of a unified Greco-Persian empire would never be fully resolved. In 323 before the Christian era, Alexander died suddenly in Babylon, possibly from fever, possibly from poisoning. He was 32 years old and had conquered the known world, but he had not named a clear successor. "The vultures didn't even wait for his body to cool," observed a Persian courtier who witnessed the immediate aftermath, his voice dripping with cynicism. Before the funeral rites were complete, his generals were already dividing his conquests. "The empire built with so much blood will drown in more blood before this is over." Indeed, Alexander's generals, known as the Diadochi, or successors, spent the next 40 years fighting among themselves for control of his empire. Eventually, the vast domain Alexander had created fractured into several Hellenistic kingdoms. The largest of these, controlling most of the former Persian Empire, was the Seleucid kingdom, named after Seleucus, one of Alexander's generals. Under Seleucid rule, a fascinating cultural synthesis took place. New cities were founded throughout the former Persian territories, often with Greek names and following the Greek polis model. Greek became the language of administration and high culture. Greek philosophical schools opened. Greek theater and athletics were introduced. The gymnasium, that distinctively Greek institution, became common even in the heart of the Iranian plateau. Yet this Hellenization was superficial in many ways. Local languages continued to be spoken. Traditional religions persisted. Persian administrative practices, proven effective over centuries, were largely retained. "My father worships Zusahora Mazda at the new temple," explained a young merchant in Seleucia the Tigris, the Seleucid capital that had replaced Babylon. "My mother still visits the traditional fire temple. I study Plato, but I also learn the Avest. We're creating something new here, neither fully Greek nor fully Persian." This cultural blending, this Hellenistic synthesis, would profoundly influence the development of civilization throughout the Middle East and Central Asia. Greek philosophical concepts mixed with Persian mystical traditions. Greek artistic techniques combined with Persian aesthetic sensibilities. Greek political theory engaged with Persian administrative experience. The Greeks have their cities. A Zoroastrian priest told his followers in a mountain village far from urban centers, "We have our mountains, our traditions, our fires that have burned since before Alexander was born." Empires rise and fall. The truth of Ahura Mazda endures, and he was right. While urban elites adopted Greek language and customs, the rural population, the vast majority of people, maintained more traditional Persian ways. The sacred fires continued to burn. The ancient festivals were still celebrated. The Persian language survived, evolving from Middle Persian into what would become New Persian, written with Arabic script but distinctly Persian in vocabulary and grammar. For the Persian aristocracy, adapting to Greek cultural norms became a path to maintaining status and influence. Many learned Greek, adopted Greek names alongside their Persian ones, participated in Greek-style education and athletics. "My son spends his mornings at the gymnasium, his afternoons studying Greek philosophy," said a Persian nobleman in Ecbatana, the old Median capital. Pride and resignation mixed in his voice. His grandfather would be horrified, exercising naked like a Greek. "But this is the world we live in now. Adapt or be left behind." Yet beneath the surface, accommodation, Persian identity, never died. It waited, preserved in language and memory, in religious practice and cultural tradition, ready to reassert itself when opportunity arose. That opportunity came from an unexpected direction: the Parthians, nomadic Iranian peoples from the northeastern frontiers, who would eventually overthrow Seleucid rule and establish a new Persian empire that would last nearly 5 centuries. But that is a story for another chapter, dear listener. For now, let us pause and reflect on what had transpired. The Achaemenid Empire, that first great Persian state, had fallen. Alexander had swept through like a storm, destroying in a decade what had taken centuries to build. The magnificent Persepolis lay in ruins, its columns silhouetted against the sky like broken teeth, yet something essential had survived. The Persian language persisted, evolving but continuous. Persian administrative practices continued under new rulers because they worked. Persian art and architecture influenced their Greek conquerors. Persian religious and philosophical ideas mixed with Greek thought to create new syntheses. Most importantly, the Persian people themselves survived. They bent under Greek rule but did not break. They learned from their conquerors while maintaining their own identity, and they waited for the wheel of fortune to turn once more. I stood one evening among the ruins of Persepolis, decades after the burning. The setting sun painted the broken columns gold and rose, almost as beautiful in destruction as they had been in glory. In the distance, I could hear shepherds calling to their flocks, life continuing in the shadows of fallen empire. A phoenix does not fear fire, I thought. It is through fire that the phoenix is reborn. Persia had fallen, but Persia would rise again. The story was far from over. The stars emerged overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, the future waited to be born.